Back in 2012, I did a GoodBadFlicks video about 2019 after the fall of New York. Had I known I'd still be doing this in actual 2019, I would have waited. 2019 is one of my favorite post-apocalyptic films, and since it's now 2019, I wanted to give a look a little bit deeper into its history and give it a proper exploration video. So for the longtime viewers, I'm sure that answers your question of, didn't he already do this? In the 70s and 80s, Italian cinema loved to make exploitation films. From spaghetti westerns to cannibal films to maxploitation, whenever there was a popular new film, they were there to rip it off. After the success of the post-apocalyptic films Mad Max and The Road Warrior, there were tons of post-apocalyptic films being made. In 1981, John Carpenter's Escape from New York was released, and it did very well domestically and internationally. Escape from New York scored highly with critics and received mostly positive reviews at the time. Roger Ebert gave it a mediocre review, saying, "Everything is here, and it all works fairly well, but it never quite comes together into an involving story or overpowering adventure." Regardless, audiences liked it, and Italian producer Sergio Martino took notice. He thought this might be the next big thing, so he was inspired to work the concepts into a new exploitation film. Although he didn't just take from Escape from New York, he melded together a few popular films to make something both similar and different. Escape from New York, The Road Warrior, and Planet of the Apes. With the basics, he contacted his brother, writer, producer, director, Sergio Martino. Martino had been directing since the 60s, with plenty of Italian exploitation films under his belt, like Torso, Slave of the Cannibal God, and High School Girl. The Martinos knew there was a lot of potential for this to be a hit, and gathered together a roughly $750,000 budget. The budget was more than many Italian films, but still significantly less than the originals. Case in point, Escape from New York had a $6.5 million budget. Italian writers Ernesto Gastaldi and Gabriele Rossini wrote the screenplay, along with input from Sergio Martino. The title of the screenplay translated to 2019 After the Fall of New York. It was set in the future after a nuclear war was triggered by a terrorist group called the Uraks. Because of the radiation, both men and women had become sterile. A mercenary is hired to track down the last fertile woman on Earth and deliver her to a Federation ship in a desperate attempt to repopulate the planet. Italian exploitation films always wanted to appeal to an international market, and the largest at the time was the United States. Because of this, Italian directors would often film under pseudonyms. For this film, Sergio Martino went under the much more American-sounding Martin Dolman. They cast the film with mostly Italian actors, who also used pseudonyms for the same reason. Romano Pupo went by Roman Gere. Paolo Maria Scalandro went by Vincent Scalandro. Luigi Montefiore went by George Eastman. They cast Anna Kanakis, an Italian model who was crowned Miss Italy when she was only 15. She went on to compete in Miss World, but was disqualified when the pageant discovered her real age. They hired English actor Edmond Perdam to play the president of the Pan American Confederacy. He was living in Italy at the time. Italian exploitation regular Hal Yamanuchi was cast to play the Rat Eater King. The film is an Italian and French co-production, so they need to have someone French in the cast. For the love interest Giara, they hired French actress Valentine Monnier. Martino was looking for the right lead to play the character of Parsifal. They needed a young, handsome, somewhat rugged actor. Essentially, since this was a knockoff of Escape from New York, they were looking for somebody similar to Kurt Russell. Michael Sopkiv was an American model working in Milan at the time, although he had an interesting road that brought him here. In the 1970s, he was a merchant sailor and sailed yachts in Miami, Florida. He was arrested by the DEA for shipping marijuana and served a year of his 2.5-year prison sentence. When he was paroled, part of the deal was that he had to stay employed. He moved to New York to study acting, and after getting an agent in Florence, he moved to Europe to be a male model. He found out there was a casting call in Rome, so he went there to try out for the film. He did a screen test for Martino, who liked his look and offered him the lead in the film. Sopkiv was more interested in acting, and happily took the lead role of Parsifal, which would be his first movie. When Sopkiv signed on for the movie, the pay was very low. He agreed to do the film as part of a 4-picture package deal, where he'd make more for each additional production. The rest of the cast was comprised of regulars and extras from various Italian films, mostly of the low-budget variety. They planned on an 8-week shoot, filming on sets in Italy and a few locations in the US in early 1983. Since the film was supposed to take place in New York, they shot the bus graveyard and junkyard scenes in Brooklyn and the Bronx. The desert scenes were filmed in Arizona. Pretty much everything else was in Italy. The Urak headquarters was a yogurt factory in Italy. The Rat Eater King's lair was an old abandoned steel factory outside of Rome. They had to be careful as the whole place was coming apart and they feared being hit on the head by falling bricks. They wouldn't legally be able to film in a location like this today due to there being too many safety hazards. Although back then the regulations were much more lax, and as such, they got away with a lot more. They filmed some of the interiors in Day Police Studios in Rome, Italy. The caves where they find the professor and his daughter were primarily used for growing mushrooms. For the destroyed New York, they used a matte painting and miniatures. For the rotting husks of buildings, they broke up fruit crates from local Italian markets and painted them black. Sopcave didn't have time to grow his hair long, so they gave him a wig with a bandana to help conceal it. Anna Kanakis spoke Italian, but learned her lines in English to impress the director. Monnier spoke both French and English. She became friends with Sopcave, and since he was very new, she helped him with his acting. For the role of Big Ape, it was offered to George Eastman. Martino had previously worked with Eastman on the 1979 film Alligator, and because of his size and physical presence, he wanted him for 2019. Eastman had just worked on another post-apocalyptic film, 1990 Bronx Warriors. He initially wasn't interested in the part because of all the makeup involved. Martino convinced him, and while he didn't like having fur glued to him and talking with cotton balls shoved up his nostrils, he did enjoy his time on the film. Monnier was very friendly, and Eastman, along with some of the other cast, had developed a crush on her. Since many of the actors only spoke Italian, they recorded everyone's dialogue, but did ADR in post. Some of the actors who spoke English were able to dub their own lines, but someone else did the voice work for Sopcave. He joked that there was an inconsistency in his audio, and wouldn't be surprised if multiple people recorded his lines. There was a scene where Parsifal is talking to Giara. Sopcave couldn't remember his lines, so he just had a regular discussion with the actress, and the studio dubbed in the correct dialogue in post. Sopcave did some of his own stunts, but had stuntmen to do the dangerous or acrobatic ones. The scene early in the film where the president's talking to Parsifal is lifted almost completely from Escape from New York. The music was done by the duo of Guido and Maurizio De Angelis as Oliver Onions. Some of the stock music in the film was reused in the red-brown Italian exploitation film, You're the Hunter from the Future. After filming, they had a fast turnaround and sent it for a rating where it received an X for violence. They had to trim some scenes, but overall, most of the gore is intact. They then rushed it into theaters in December of 1983. Over time, it played in theaters across the world, including a few hundred screens in the US. The movie was a modest hit, and there was talk of a sequel, but it never happened. Like many movies at the time, 2019 After the Fall of New York did well, but ultimately was forgotten by all except for the cult market. Eastman continued to do lots of films, many of which were in the post-apocalyptic genre. Warriors of the Wasteland, Endgame, Hands of Steel, and others. In 1990, he wrote and directed a movie I covered a while back, the sci-fi horror film Metamorphosis. Sopcave followed up this film with the second in his contract, the Lamberto Bava action film BLASTFIGHTER. BLASTFIGHTER was originally written as a post-apocalyptic film, but for whatever reason, it was later changed to be just an action film. The producers canceled Sopcave's contract, and he wasn't able to make the full 4 pictures under the deal, so he lost out. He did keep working and did another Bava production, the Jawsploitation film Devilfish, which was sold in some markets as Monster Shark. In the film, he was reunited with Monnier, who once again played his love interest. After Devilfish, Monnier did the French comedy 3 Men in a Cradle, which was remade in the US as 3 Men and a Baby. After that, she did one more French film and then left the industry. Sopcave put together an acting reel showcasing his work in various films. When meeting with casting agents, they all seemed concerned with how different his voice sounded from film to film. They couldn't quite seem to wrap their brains around the fact that numerous people dubbed his voice in Italian films. In the early 90s, Sopcave was living in Manhattan Beach. One night he went to a video store, and behind the counter was a very enthusiastic video clerk. The guy recognized him from 2019 and proceeded to talk about his movies in greater detail than Sopcave remembered. That guy was Quentin Tarantino. In the early 2000s, Media Blasters released the film on DVD. Along with some interviews on the disc, they had a commentary with Michael Sopcave and some folks jokingly calling themselves post-nuke historians. Unfortunately, one of the commentators had a bone to pick with some people who ran various movie forums. He then proceeded to name them and call them out for various reasons.
Still do want to reiterate the point that we're not film historians.
Oh, God, no.
We've just done this to piss off the pretentious people who, congregate at like and that boob. And these are the people that are ruining, the industry. We're no longer watching it for the films. It's for the collectability, and, there's no appreciation anymore.
It seemed at least one of those that was named allegedly threatened to sue, so the company recalled the DVDs and reissued them without the commentary, making the original pressing a bit of a collector's item. In 2015, Code Red released the film on Blu-ray with an all-new commentary with Michael Sopcave. They mentioned the commentary on the previous release, but didn't have any additional information on it. 2019 After the Fall of New York may be a shameless knockoff, but it does enough differently to make it stand on its own. People often turn their noses up at exploitation, but what's the current state of cinema other than exploitation with a bigger budget? The Island ripped off Clonus the Parts Horror so badly they went to court over it. The makers of Clonus sued for copyright infringement and won a settlement from the studio. The Lion King ripped off the TV series Kimba the White Lion. Home Alone ripped off the 1989 French film Game Over. Even 2019 seems to be the inspiration for the movie Children of Men. Children of Men was based off the 1992 P.D. James novel The Children of Men. It starts in 2021 and details a world where humans have become sterile and war has broken out between multiple factions. A university professor, Theo, meets with a group of rebels who have with them a pregnant woman. In the movie Children of Men, the year is 2027. Something happens which makes everyone on Earth sterile. A bureaucrat named Theo is asked by his ex-wife to escort the first pregnant woman in 18 years to safety. He needs to take her to the Human Project ship The Tomorrow, in a desperate attempt to repopulate the planet. While it's unclear if the book was inspired by 2019 After the Fall of New York, it's clear that the movie at the very least took some inspiration from it. Aside from the basic similarities, there's a few standouts. In both 2019 and Children of Men, they have the women being delivered to a ship, which is something that isn't in the book. The other is in 2019 in the Eurex headquarters, we see the Picasso painting Guernica. In Children of Men, we see the same painting. It's far too random to be a coincidence. At the very least, either the art director or the director was familiar with 2019 and threw it in there as a nod. The 2012 film Lockout played like Escape from New York in space, so much so that John Carpenter sued the company in French court for plagiarism and won not once, but twice. Probably a good thing he didn't see 2019 at the time.
They've been combing the city for you guys like you was bunches of bananas.